Hi, my name is Adriana Hazelton, and today we'll be talking about culture within emergency management. So, the first thing we'll be talking about today is what is culture? Culture is essentially a combination of shared beliefs, ideas, and traditions within a group. They're easily identified by social behavior, attitudes, and activities. Anthropologically speaking, it's a social phenomena that cannot be explained by genetics. So a person is not born thinking or acting a certain way. They learn it through generations, through their parents, their grandparents, and other members of society, or they assimilate into a new one. And this applies to disaster victims, as disaster victims are essentially isolated from their region or the country based on the disaster that had happened. And so the community together searches for meaning and for reasons to act a certain way. And through that, they create a new culture and a new set of norms, whether it is temporary or not, until the end of recovery. So, the culture of disaster victims, we can also call them emergent norms, they evolve out of isolation and not over time. These cultures are temporary. They result basically from the beginning of the disaster until the end of recovery when things go back to normal. And these outcomes vary based on milling processes and previous cultures and behaviors. The pre existing cultures of the victims usually dictate how they behave in the culture that results post disaster. And social order and milling processes also play a huge part in how disaster victims choose to react and behave. A really good example for comparing and contrasting is Andrew in South Florida and Katrina in Louisiana. Now, Schneider's 5 factors of influence are super important to consider. They are essentially what influence the gap between emergent and bureaucratic norms, which can also be considered as the culture and how compatible it is to the bureaucratic norms and what the government wants to do with that disaster. These include the magnitude of the disaster, the degree of government preparedness, the level of communication and coordination, the goals of the government response system, and the orientation of the disaster victims. Now, the orientation of the disaster victims is essentially what the culture is post disaster. However, I feel that the other 4 factors also do affect the orientation or the culture of the disaster victims. Now, the culture is pretty much predetermined by other factors as well, but these 4 factors also do affect the attitude and the behavior of the disaster victims and factor into that culture as well. So we're going to take a look at Hurricane Andrew and the culture that emerged out of that disaster. Hurricane Andrew was a Category 5 hurricane that hit South Florida in the late August of 1992. Destruction was so severe that there was really no one that was capable to take action for the victims. The local officials ended up victims themselves, and the few people that could help were not able to communicate with each other, and there was no transportation available because all the roads were blocked and all the bridges destroyed, and there was really no way to communicate or transport anything, and it was a complete mess. This resulted in an immediate milling process and a huge gap in emergent and bureaucratic norms. South Floridians began looting, pilfering, taking advantage of each other by making prices skyrocket when they could if they were selling something, and a lot of people were walking around with shotguns to defend themselves. And the culture during Andrew was very hostile and violent, causing recovery to take a lot more time than it could have taken otherwise if people had been a little more together and tight knit. It could be that Hurricane Andrew would have been a little faster to recover just because so much effort was put into trying to recreate the social order that was there before Andrew hit. And this was really a result out of South Florida being a really new community where many had just moved from South Florida from different regions to the north, from Minnesota, New York, and Connecticut, and Vermont, and all these different places. People began moving to South Florida for good weather, ended up in bad weather. And because these people really didn't create a tight knit, mature community, there was nothing connecting anybody to each other, and this resulted into a lot more violence and hostility than it would be in a different community. Now, Hurricane Katrina was even more severe than Hurricane Andrew. However, there was a completely different culture going on despite the devastation. While there was pilfering, looting, and violence, this was not the overall true norm. Many victims were volunteering to help each other out by giving bus rides, distributing food, helping give others shelter when they could, and doing search missions for missing people. And this was majorly a result out of the Cajun culture in New Orleans and them being very tight knit and a mature community, which allowed them to be more close to each other and more unwilling to take advantage of each other. So there was more positive and constructive emergent cultural norms. So despite the devastation that was there and it being much worse than Andrew, the people there were very helpful of one another, and it could have been a lot worse without that. So one of the most important things to consider when talking about culture and emergency management is to really be aware of how many cultures there truly are. The US is a melting pot of different and contrasting cultures, and the belief systems, the education levels, and attitudes have varying impacts on otherwise very similar disasters. Katrina and Andrew were both Category 5 hurricanes, and Katrina was worse in terms of the area hit was not a good location to have a Category 5 hurricane of that level. However, in the end, they were both hurricanes with very, very destructive levels. But New Orleans had a more mature and homogenous culture, creating a more positive impact onto the recovery period, while South Florida was still very new and no one really knew each other, so everyone was very distant and hostile when it came to a disaster situation. And having an understanding of the area's culture and the situation that they're in previous to the disaster can be very advantageous toward recovery. And this is a really important reason to have local autonomy, because local officials will have the best idea of what's going on in that community and they can figure out what's the best course of action to take care of those victims. Now, FEMA has a whole community approach that recognizes local autonomy. They understand that local officials have the best understanding of their district and the cultures that are within those districts. And this allows local officials to develop emergency plans that cater better to the needs of potential disaster victims beyond the basic recovery of communication, shelter, and food. Different religions, education levels, disabilities will require different things. And a federal agency such as FEMA has no way of learning all those things so quickly, and the best way is to let the local officials have their ideas and plans to deal with those situations because they've already had the experience and the prior knowledge to know what's going on within their own communities. In conclusion, each community affected by a disaster has its previous norms and behaviors, which will greatly affect how the community will react once a disaster strikes. Local officials and FEMA must work together to understand better the implications that these cultures cause and how to respond to disasters better based on the needs of that community and not necessarily through generic protocol. A generic protocol is really good as guidelines, but to understand the niches and unique qualities of that community, one really needs to have the local officials in charge because they have the prior knowledge and experience to know what to do and how to do certain things that will better suit that community. And that's impossible to do through such a huge agency such as FEMA that is in charge of such a large country. And taking culture into consideration and how previous cultures will affect how the community will react post disaster is really important in order to have a successful recovery plan.